Welcome back to One Piece Explained. We are almost through these episode breakdowns, and we have a bit of a lighter one today with episode 6 of the One Piece live action series by Netflix and Tomorrow Studios. There are some fun details in here, but before we get into it, I will note that these breakdowns won't be going in depth on any big reveals for the series that are best experienced at your own pace. However, we will be discussing things like characters, story arcs, and settings in a more general sense. If you've been enjoying these breakdowns, I would truly appreciate it if you subscribed. We have 2 more episodes to go, and they are pretty big ones. And with that all said, let's get into the breakdown for episode 6, The Chef and the Chore Boy. This episode starts off with the aftermath of the previous episode's duel between Zoro and Mihawk. The crew are scrambling to help Zoro, and Nami suggests that someone go back to the Baratier to seek out a doctor. Now, in the source material, Zoro's injury is not used as a point of tension to this extent, but it does come back up later in the following arc. But using this injury as a point to drive the current narrative works well in this adaptation, plus it sees the necessity for a ship's doctor in Season 1, whereas in the source material, we wouldn't need one explicitly until later on in the series. Luffy rushes into the kitchen of the Baratier where Sanji and Zeph are preparing food, and Zeph mentions that the nearest doctor is on the Konomi Islands. This is a reference to Dr. Nako, or Nako, who we saw during the Arlong Park arc as the village doctor. When Zeph says there's not much that he can do, Sanji heads for the cupboard to try and help, equating the situation to their philosophy of feeding anyone in need. On top of the cupboard, you can see these huge jars of oregano. Zeph really seems to love the stuff, but besides it is a bottle of whiskey, and inside the cabinet is a bottle of kerosene. The title card for this episode has Sanji's personal Jolly Roger in the O, and notice they did retain the curly eyebrow here. The I in One Piece has been replaced with one of Sanji's kitchen knives, and the P features a heart, nodding to his flirtatious nature. Zeph brought the aforementioned bottle of whiskey, and we can make out that it's actually the same brand of whiskey that we saw in episode 2 during Luffy's flashback where he was using the bottle as target practice. He stitches Zoro up and places fish skin on the wounds, as it is known to have anti-inflammatory and antibacterial properties, and this all here acts as a nice hint towards Zeph's history of being a pirate and being so knowledgeable about being on the sea. Over on the Marine side, Mihawk reports that he let Luffy go, and I love how they have him seated before the Marines and world government like he does in the manga as well, so carefree. And before he leaves, he ends up tipping off Kobe that Luffy is Garp's grandson, confusing the young Marine even more. Back with the Straw Hats, we have a few outfit changes for the crew. Both of Usopp's long-sleeve white shirt and Luffy's blue shirt with the white shoulder accents look to be inspired by their appearances on the color spread featured in chapter 107. Luffy is preparing Zoro's Wado Ichimonji while the crew eats rice balls, or onigiri. And of course, Zoro has a technique called onigiri, which translates more literally to demon cutter or ogre cutter, but that's also the pun here, as that's what rice balls are called. Of note, when Sanji asks what Zoro's favorite food is, Luffy replies that he really likes rice balls and asks if he can make them soaked in beer, and I guess that isn't too far off from Zoro's favorite food as told to us in Volume 45's SBS, which consists of white rice, sea beast meat, and anything that goes well with alcohol. We get Sanji's flashback to his days on the orbit, and he's told by one of the chefs that he doesn't need to be making anything as fancy as the velouté he's working on. This chef is named in the credits as Meshi, who is a character unique to this live action, though he's likely an adaptation of this cook from Sanji's flashback that deemed the all blue as fake. Of note, Meshi was also the name of the restaurant that the crew ate at in Syrup Village in the source material. Sanji's innate taste for the finer things here is definitely a nice nod towards something that happens much later on in the series, hundreds of chapters down the line. The chef then tells Sanji to get to the tables, a nice parallel to how we were introduced to him in the prior episode with being reprimanded by Zeph for making something off the menu and forced to wait tables. A younger Zeph walks into the kitchen, and I like the nice touch of the red-soaked boots, harkening back to his epithet, red leg or red shoes, depending on the translation. This bit of him trying Sanji's cooking and adding oregano, leading to Sanji's now infamous Oreganos for Savages line, has to be the funniest moment in the entire series. This was of course added just for this live action, but even so, it's a really fun addition. A storm hits, and you can make out the passenger ship Orbit that we saw earlier in the episode with the wine bottle up front, but you can also make out the Cooking George, the ship used by Zeph and his cook pirates. Among Sanji's supply of food are some cans that read Pigeon Arrosé. This is a nod to a dish from Shokeki no Sanji, the One Piece collaboration done by the creators of Food Wars. There are also some cans of what looks to be cream of pumpkin. Pumpkins played an important thematic role in a future saga that also gets referenced later in this episode, which we'll touch on soon. The reveal of Zeph eating his leg to survive hits very hard in this adaptation, and I think I even prefer the way it was revealed here, as we discover it alongside Sanji, whereas in the source material, we're shown Zeph removing his leg a whole chapter prior to Sanji finding out. Back in present day, we get Nami in a new outfit as well, this time wearing clothes inspired by her appearance on the cover of Volume 11, and she's reading a story to Zoro to try and get through to him. Now, this is a huge departure from the source material that doesn't really matter much in the short term, but it may have some ramifications in the future as she's reading the story of Noland the Liar. Now, in the source material, this was a tale that the crew would come across much later on during the Jaya arc, and the majority of the crew was not familiar with it, including Nami, whereas here, Nami seems to have the book on hand. Now, this may not necessarily mean that this is Nami's book. It could have just been on the ship when gifted to the crew by Kaya, which would then add a new cool texture to that act, given that Usopp is also a notorious liar. Either way, this story is part of the impetus for a grand adventure the crew embarks on, so seating it all the way in season 1 of the show is a very interesting move. We get an adaptation of this page from the storybook, and they even adapted the Panda Man that was hiding on the page. Really cool stuff. Behind Nami on the wall are several paintings that have been very difficult to make out. The one that has the most visible features looks to include a large creature or structure, perhaps even a shrub of some sorts that reminds me a lot of an elephant, though there is also a statue or shrub of a seahorse that we get a closer shot of. Now, there were seahorse-shaped shrubs back in Kaya's mansion garden, so perhaps this is an artistic rendition of that. But for the other paintings, they're a bit harder to make out. If you guys have any guesses, I would love to know in the comments. Over on the marine side, we get a bit more between Koby and Garp, and Koby maintains that Luffy will always be a pirate no matter what. I think it's at this point that we as viewers start to get a better understanding of why Garp is here in this season in the first place. In this adaptation, Garp is still trying to stop Luffy from becoming a pirate, and so he wishes to cut him off before he gets to the Grand Line. While the presence of Garp was fairly jarring at first, I do think it makes a lot of sense for him to want to get in Luffy's way and try to prevent him from becoming a full-fledged pirate. We've seen throughout the source material that Garp wanted to stop Luffy during his youth, but for whatever reason, he let him act on his own after some period of years. Ultimately, I think this works and makes sense. Back at the Baratie, we get the arrival of the Arlong Pirates, and they look great. He demands Straw Hat Luffy and the map to the Grand Line, but in the meanwhile, he decides to eat a meal. We get a shot of some customers, and on the table is a bottle of alcohol reading 2 slow pills. While most alcoholic beverages in this series have been references to something in the source material, this one is a bit harder to place. There's nothing that shares this name in or outside the source material from what I can tell, and a generous interpretation of this might be referring to the concept of a valley, and there was a certain location, God Valley, that was introduced relatively recently in the story, but I don't think I'm getting anywhere with this line of thinking, so I would love to hear what you all think about this bottle. Perhaps this was a phrase that was used on a color spread or cover story of some sorts that I just can't think of. We also get a slightly better look at one of the other paintings that are in this episode, and this one reminds me a lot of Water 7, though it is difficult to be sure as always. Arlong gets into an altercation with a customer, Matsul, who is present in the source material but merely as a background character during the Baratie arc. Here, Arlong asserts that the ignorance of humans comes from their lack of knowledge about fishmen, which is of course just a nod to how ignorance and prejudice works in general, usually, but this could also be seen as a nod to the Koala's explanation of why humans are afraid of fishmen that we would get in the source material during the Fishman Island arc. Luffy barges into the Baratie asking which one of them is Arlong, harkening to his initial meeting with Arlong in the source material. We learn that Buggy has been helping the Arlong Pirates track down the Straw Hats by sneaking his ear into Luffy's straw hat. This was all foreshadowed back in episode 2 and 3, with Buggy's line of having eyes and ears everywhere, of course, but also with Zoro's line after seeing Buggy's wanted poster in Syrup Village, saying that they should have cut his head off, stuck it in a bag, and taken it with them. Fighting ensues, and we get Kurobi deliver 100 brick fists to Zeph, sending him flying. This angers Sanji, who jumps in and delivers a few kicks that could be seen as adaptations of his successive attacks during the climax of his fight with Kurobi in the source material. He fires off a kick to the neck, perhaps inspired by the Collier coup, and then goes for a leg sweep where the movement somewhat matches his stance taken during the delivery of his Kotelet, Kabosh, and Stealth strikes, though those techniques are hitting his torso in the source material, whereas here he just goes for a leg sweep, so not one-to-one for sure. During Arlong's fight with Luffy, we get an adaptation of Arlong's technique where he splashes a handful of water at the enemy with such force that it's capable of actual damage. Also notice that Arlong's laugh is adapted as well, with the sha ha ha ha. Characters in the world of One Piece often have a unique laughter style that wasn't properly translated or adapted in the very early chapters of One Piece in the Viz editions, but they are maintained throughout the rest of it. And we get the big twist of Nami's betrayal here, but to me, this read more as a last-ditch attempt of her saving the crew's lives. She had pleaded to Luffy not to fight with Arlong earlier in this episode, and she wished to set sail and get away, which suggests to me that she actually did want to continue sailing with them just a little while longer if possible, and she didn't want harm to come across them. However, with how much Luffy has been failing to act like a captain across these past 2 episodes, Nami had no choice but to give up her own happiness to protect those that she cared about. Nami stopping Arlong from killing Luffy and suggesting to let the sea do it could be seen as an adaptation of her stepping in to save Usopp from Arlong in the source material, resulting in him being spared and thrown into the water as well. After Arlong throws Luffy in the water, we get an adaptation of Sanji saving Luffy after the Battle of the Baratie arc. Then Sanji goes to clean up the mess inside and gets into an argument with Zeph, a light adaptation of Zeph and the Baratie chefs trying to get Sanji to go out on his own adventure like he wants, and on the ceiling you can also spot the Jolly Roger of the Cook Pirates. Zoro wakes up and pledges his loyalty to Luffy, sort of a continued adaptation of his oath from the previous episode, and the crew all decides to go after Nami. We get an outfit change for Zoro, this one inspired by his appearance during the Arlong Park arc and as seen on the cover of Volume 9. Behind him seems to be another box that reads Shipwright Tools, likely a similar box to the flashback in episode 2 that was from the Galila Company. Sanji joins the crew, and Zeph and the Baratie staff send him off, recreating the emotional goodbye from the source material, but that's not the only addition to the team, as Zoro's words from episode 3 end up coming true, and they take Buggy's head with them. And of course, we have some more credits maps. We get the Baratie again, though this time it's decorated with cooking utensils and a plate and bowl around it. There's also a map of the Oikot Kingdom. This is the country Nami was originally from, and soon after, a map showing the proximity between the Oikot Kingdom and the Sambas region. And I'm not entirely sure how canonical this is, but hey, it's cool nonetheless. And finally, the Oikot Kingdom is added to the larger map of the East Blue. And that's about it for this episode. The second in each pair of episodes tends to feel like it has less explicit details since it spends a lot more time in the same setting as the previous one, but hey, there were a lot of fun details in here nonetheless. With that said, we are left with just 2 more episodes to break down, and these are what everything has been building towards, so I can't wait to get into them. If you've been enjoying these breakdowns so far, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. Thank you all for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.